this video, we're going to explain selective reabsorption. So if you haven't watched it yet, you can check out my previous video on the first stage in the glomerulus and the Bowman's capsule, which is ultrafiltration. But now we're moving on from ultrafiltration to selective reabsorption. Now, the first thing we should know is where selective reabsorption takes place. So it's in here. And this is the proximal convoluted tubule. So we've produced the filtrate now following the process of ultrafiltration, and the filtrate is moving into the nephron and into the proximal convoluted tubule. So if we go to this diagram here, so this is inside the proximal convoluted tubule, or the lumen. These are the epithelial cells that line the proximal convoluted tubule, and this is a blood capillary. Now, we don't want to lose things like glucose or amino acids in our urine. So what's going to happen here is we are going to reabsorb all of the glucose and all of the amino acids, because remember, they were filtered in the glomerulus and the Bowman's capsule. So they were small enough. They entered the Bowman's capsule. They will be in the PCT now, but we don't want them to remain in the nephron. We want to reabsorb them back into our blood so we don't lose these things in our urine. So how does this work? Well, what we're going to do is look at another mechanism, another example of co-transport. So here, we've got a carrier protein. This is an example of a sodium-potassium pump. And this protein is going to actively transport sodium ions from the epithelial cells, actively transporting those sodium ions out across the wall of the capillary or the endothelium and into the blood. Now, why are we doing that? This will make sure that there is a low concentration of sodium ions inside the epithelial cell, and that means that sodium ions will then start to diffuse in from the lumen of the proximal convoluted tubule and into the epithelial cell. The reason they will diffuse in is because by actively transporting them out of the epithelial cell into the blood, we've got a low concentration of sodium ions in here. There's a higher concentration of sodium ions in the lumen of the PCT. So they're diffusing in down their concentration gradient. But this is a co-transport protein. So as the sodium ions diffuse in down their concentration gradient, they will carry with them a molecule of glucose or a specific amino acid. Now we've got the glucose and the amino acids in the epithelial cell. They can then diffuse from a higher concentration in the epithelial cell to a lower concentration in the blood. Now this would be an example of facilitated diffusion. It's going from a higher concentration to a lower concentration, but it does need a transport protein. Now we've reabsorbed it. We've got the glucose or we've got the amino acids back into the blood so they will not be lost in the urine. But it relies on different transport methods. So we had the active transport of sodium ions, so to keep the concentration of sodium ions low in the epithelial cell. Then we had co-transport of sodium ions in with glucose or amino acids. And then we had the facilitated diffusion of glucose or amino acids into the blood. We've reabsorbed them. And because we've got a lower water potential in the blood compared to the epithelial cell, and a lower water potential in the epithelial cell compared to the lumen of the PCT, we're also going to see water being reabsorbed by osmosis. So water's going to follow those sodium ions, the glucose, the amino acids, and the water's going to move by osmosis from a higher water potential in the lumen of the PCT into the epithelial cell and into the blood. Now, you might get questions asking you about how these cells are adapted for this process. Obviously, we can see they've got a folded membrane, or microvilli, as we call them. So obviously, they've got an increased surface area. We've also got lots of transport proteins. We've got high numbers of sodium-potassium pumps. We've got high numbers of these carrier proteins. We've got high numbers of co-transport proteins. But on top of that, these cells will also have a high number of mitochondria. Because obviously this active transport of sodium ions to maintain that sodium ion gradient, that active transport requires ATP. So these cells will also have a large number of mitochondria for aerobic respiration to provide that ATP. And that's it. That's the proximal convoluted tubule, that's selective reabsorption, and it's also your examples of how these epithelial cells are adapted for selective reabsorption. I hope you found that useful. Stay tuned for another video on the loop of Henle.